to share with you a little bit about a dream that I had, but first on how we get here, because obviously this isn't what I did for a living. But I started a documentary on joy and happiness because I thought it was something that we, you know, as a people really need to focus on, that it was important. And I took it around to HBO. I had all kinds of research. I learned so much about happiness because I was thinking, what are the causes of happiness? And why is it that we can get into this state, get out of it? Can we get back into a happy state? And science has always been interesting to me. So I started looking into it. And then I went to HBO and I went to these places and they look at me and say, yeah, but what is it? What is happiness? I mean, what is it? What is this show going to look like? What is it? And I thought, you know, this is the problem, is that happiness is not front and center in terms of what it is that we need to be able to experience. And what I learned from all of this stuff is that, you know, neurologically and so on and so forth, and physiologically, the great benefits from being able to resource some of these emotions, some of this experience. In the meantime, we had a terrible event, and that was 9/11. And in the light of 9/11 and the horrors of 9/11, I realized that we needed to focus on this greatly with our children because the world would never be the same again. And in learning all the things I learned about what we can do to create this sort of optimum state of being, I thought, you know, let's do something drastic. Let's hope and pray for all kids to experience happiness. What a dream that was. Has a very brave, very broad dream, bringing children happiness. So what we did is I pulled together a lot of neuroscientists and doctors and researchers and educators and positive psychologists, and we brought us all together and created a curriculum. The curriculum was very interesting because we looked at some of the symptoms. Some of them were depression on the rise, suicide on the rise, a lot of over-medicated children, tremendous pharmaceutical companies flourishing, parents not knowing what to do with their kids, dropouts beyond belief. And so you think, well, let's create a curriculum just to make children happy. Well, actually, what we needed to do was address a lot of these different symptomatic things that are happening with the kids in schools. So we pulled together all of these people and we created a curriculum called Mind Up. And Mind Up is a way for children to actually get in touch with their emotions, to regulate their emotions, to manage their stress, to all of these things that sort of lead to an inability to focus and a lack of absorption or learning or retention. Also, the joy of going to school. How about that? And with all of it, I thought if we could create an optimistic classroom, a classroom that has a sense of joy, optimism, potential, hopefulness, that we'd be able to create a new world. So in doing so, we created a 15-lesson curriculum. Now, what we did was, aside from the fact of allowing a child the knowledge and the tools how to reduce their own stress, which is through focused breathing, focused attention, focused relaxation, focused awareness, there was also another issue. Why don't they know about their brains? Why is it that our children are in the dark with the things that we already know? So we've learned so much about the brain. I learned it during my research for happiness. I thought, wow, this has really helped me. I now am be able to understand a little bit more about my behavior. Why can't our children know this? Why can't we give them a little piece of what goes on inside of that magical head of theirs? So we added neuroscience. So they learn neuroscience. They learn about their brains. They're learning also about how to quiet their mind, because stress blocks learning. Why? Because when the midbrain is overactivated, the prefrontal cortex, which is our executive function, and all children have one, is blocked off and dims. So when we want to open that up for learning, we have to take the stress away. So here we are learning out the brain. We're also understanding how to reduce stress. But now we have pro-social behaviors. Today, we all have seen in the news this horrible thing that happened with this woman, young girl, who is being raped. I can't even say it without feeling like I feel like crying. They watched for hours. Now, this is a group of children who I'm sure are not bad children, but they have lost empathy. They don't understand where their empathy is, what they care about, what matters to them, who matters to them. So therefore, the other part of the section of this is their place in terms of understanding themselves in the world. So our section is all about perspective taking, role changing. This is also part of what we do. In case we also look at acts of kindness, what they can do to help others. And what we're learning and what the kids are learning is that everything that they are actually doing in the classroom has a brain link. Because what happens to your brain when you do something wonderful for somebody, the same thing that happens to them in the giving happens to you in the receiving, and vice versa. It's a wonderful emission of dopamine. Dopamine is a terrific neurotransmitter. We love to do our dopamine dances in class because we know these are the ways to support well-being and productivity. So we then took mindful senses. So we have 4 sections. We have mindful senses, your place in the universe and your society, quieting the mind, and understanding the brain. We then researched it, because I wasn't going to go out and research, or speak rather, about anything that wasn't, researched, that we didn't have real data on. And the data now came back on this, and it absolutely blew our socks off. We have about a 60% rise in optimism in our class, so therefore we are calling this the optimistic classroom, because optimism has gone up significantly. Aggression went down significantly. The children that were absent from school suddenly were no longer absent from school. So we were already having an optimum effect. We then did pro-social behaviors. The children were getting along better. Now, the best part of it is we did a cortisol test. So the cortisol study we did, where we had the kids spit into a tube, is that they came back from Germany, and what came back is that our children of Mind Up program were able to manage, control their cortisol levels. The control group could not. Now, this is a stress hormone, and think of the implications it has in the future for healthcare. Then we go on and we do executive function. And this is actual brain neurobiology done by Adele Diamond at the University of British Columbia. And what came back there is that our children actually had a much faster and more, they're quicker on the uptake in terms of their executive function, which means that that improved. So here's what happened. Just from one wish of children to be happier, the Pandora's box was opened. And when we started going into this Alice in Wonderland world of interconnectivity, we realized that all of these things interconnect and integrate in the brain to create a wholer, happier child. Our math grades went up, our reading scores went up, our children academically are doing better. And I believe that if we're going to build a better society, a better world, a more peaceful world, then we must give these tools to our children to move forward. Oh, that was perfect. Well, it's like a drum beat. It's, after the joke, they go, bum. Anyway, so this is what I've been doing. I'm excited to share this with you. I'm very honored to be asked to speak here today. I think this is one of the great answers in terms of all of the technology and everything that we have done and the places that we have gone. We now have to work and know that we've got tremendous technology right here. We have a way to access it. We have a way to help our children access it. And therefore, we have a way to feel much more hopeful about our future. This is Dr. Dan Siegel. He has written The Mindful Brain and done incredible work with the Mindsight Institute, which he has created. He's got a new book out, Mindsight. He's a good friend of mine. He will explain to you all the things that were basically in my dreams.
That's great. Thanks, Goldie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us. What I'm going to talk about very briefly in this time is how the present educational system that we have is actually imprisoning the brains of our children. That by focusing on the very important skills that we all learn, reading, writing, arithmetic, but not on another set of R's, which I'm going to suggest to you is what the Mind Up program does, and what all schools need to do, is to look at reflection, relationships, and resilience. And we now have the technology, as Goldie is describing it, to actually promote a different kind of brain growth. Because now what's happening, and we're all in the healthcare world here, is that we have a damaged brain that's growing, and it's getting more and more handicapped as kids get more focused on the external world rather than being able to look at the internal world. And so what we really need to do is take our background in healthcare, apply it to education, and think, how do we actually tap into what is not going on? How can 20 kids watch a young woman being raped for hours and do nothing? How do we explain that? How do we explain that people can act as if other human beings don't have an internal core of experience and that are worth knowing and protecting? So what I'm going to suggest to you is that kids from very early on have the capability of developing something called Mindsight, the ability to actually see the internal world of themselves, their subjective worlds, and the internal worlds of others. And ultimately, Mindsight is something that can be taught or it can be discarded. So when I was in medical school, for example, I had professors who acted as if the people we were dealing with were just collections of organs and didn't have feelings. In fact, I was told repeatedly not to check into the stories of the patients or their feelings, or to understand that they had an internal life. There was no time for tears, as they said. Yet Mindsight is something that can be developed through relationships, even if you're in medical school and you have professors who are telling you the mind doesn't exist. In fact, the mind does exist. Now, how many of you are in the healthcare field? Let me see. Oh, I can't do the study. Okay, it's not everyone. You know, I've asked 80,000 mental health practitioners if they've ever had a lecture on the mind, and it turns out that only 5% have ever even had one lecture. And this is true across the board around the globe. The ability to look at the mind is something that we can't ignore anymore, because the capacity to do something with your internal world is actually possible and necessary, and it promotes this experience in the brain that integrates the entire brain. And I usually give 8-hour lectures, not 8-minute talks, so this is basically a take-home message. But neural integration, I want to suggest to you, is the heart of health. Integration, if we had time to talk about it, we would go into it, I think is a definition of health in general. And what we can do is look at this triangle of well-being as fundamentally a triangle of an integrated system that can't just be about the brain. We have to look at, in fact, how information and energy that flow in our lives is passed along neural circuits, and when those circuits are integrated, you get a resilient mind and you get empathic relationships. And when you block any area of there, if you block, for example, integration in the brain, you'll impair empathy in relationships, and you'll make the mind not resilient and coherent. And there's a whole way of thinking about this, but I want you to keep this triangle in mind as we go forward with the next slides. As you all know, the way experience shapes us is through altering these synaptic connections in the brain, and we could spend a long time talking about how experience, both what you get from the outside world as well as where you focus your attention. This is the whole key to understanding Goldie's Mind Up program. Where you focus attention stimulates the firing of specific circuits in the brain. And we actually now know incredible amounts about which circuits we need to activate to plug in a child's brain to become empathic and self-understanding. We know that. The question is, can we actually do it? Can we think about what's happened in education and redo our approach to the basic R's, and instead of just giving reading, writing, arithmetic, actually offer reflection as a skill that actually harnesses specific circuits in the brain that develop this capacity called Mindsight, which is something you can develop even in teenagers. In my research program at UCLA, the Mindful Awareness Research Center, as well as the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development, 2 research centers I help run, we actually are studying the way cultural experiences impact on synaptic growth in the brain using MRI and all that stuff. In our Mindful Awareness Research Center, we actually took teenagers and adults with attention problems, and we were able to get more executive function improvements with mindfulness techniques, reflective techniques, than you get with medications. And those were long-lasting improvements, not just something you had to take a pill to get. And the question is, can we actually realize now the power of neuroplasticity, including how you teach children how to focus their attention? So what I'm going to suggest to you is a solution in terms of our last presentation about healthcare and health communication is there was a time when people did not brush their teeth. And yet now, how many of you brush your teeth every day? Let's see. So something happened in terms of health communication. We need the exact same grassroots movement to make brain brushing a daily brain hygiene technique. Because we know if you take a certain reflective skill, and we don't have time here to do it, but I'll just tell you, it's the capacity, for example, as William James said, to take a wandering attention and return it again and again to its target. He said back in 1890 we didn't know how to do it. We actually know how to do it. And you can do it with a simple exercise of watching the breath. The mind gets distracted, you refocus on the breath. It's in almost every major wisdom tradition in the world, ancient and modern. But we don't do it in schools because we call it religion. But instead, it's actually a brain hygiene practice that does something very specific to keep the brain not only working well, but actually to develop an integrated brain. That our whole hypothesis that neural integration is the basis of health comes from the notion that you can integrate this organ of the body. And when you do, you get an amazing thing happening with the area just behind your forehead. And this is extensively reviewed, and I have a whole series of books called the Series on Interpersonal Neurobiology, 15 textbooks for professionals that I edit, and the Mindful Brain book, and the new book, Mindsight. You can see that these functions are functions that emerge from reflective skills of Mindsight that you can develop in kids. And you think about how many of these would you like your child or yourself or your spouse to have? The capacity to regulate your body and keep the heart and lungs and intestines working well. The capacity to tune into other people and really attend to their internal world, including attuning to yourself. The capacity to balance your emotions so life has meaning and energy, but not too much so it's revved up and chaotic, not too little so it's rigid and depleted. The capacity to extinguish fear after being traumatized. The ability to pause before you act so that you're flexible, and the capacity to have insight into yourself, connecting the past, present, and future, the ability to have empathy for others, the capacity for morality even, and the ability to be in touch with the creativity of intuition. Now, this list, how many of you would like some of those, right? How many of you like your child to have many, maybe all of them? We actually know how to develop this list. And the science behind it is all in these references I'm talking to you about. So the great news is that with a program like Mind Up, or any program where you're teaching Mindsight, the ability to actually see the mind, gives you the capacity, in fact, to deliver a child through adolescence with an integrated brain, to inspire them to rewire their brains toward integration. And when you do this, the result is going to be a child who balances the power of the mind to regulate energy and information flow within oneself and with others, the power to create an integrated brain, and the ability to make relationships compassionate and empathic. We have the path to create this. It's just a matter of whether we're ready to do that. Thank you very much.